When it comes to the Second World War, we often tend to split the conflict in at least two. One part being that war fought in Europe with the Germans and their allies against many other nations, and the other being that fought in the Pacific, largely against the empire building of the Japanese. And while this is true, there is of course a link between these two, hence why it's referred to as the Second World War. Part of that link being that Nazi Germany did in fact ally with Japan as part of the war aims, although how much they were able to help each other is debatable. But that makes what I'm going to talk about in this video so interesting, at least to me, and I hope that you'll agree, because even though Nazi Germany's stated aim, and indeed what is often seen as the start of the war, at least in Europe, was the invasion of Poland, well, Poland and Japan, on the other hand, actually got along very, very well, and may even be referred to as some kind of friends for a while before and during the Second World War. So how did this friendship between Poland and Japan come about, and what did it look like during the Second World War? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back in time, and it's surprisingly older than you might actually think. Because of course we have that Poland was a strong state in Europe as part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was partitioned 3 times towards the end of the 18th century. Parts being given to what would become Germany, other parts going into Austria or Austria-Hungary, and the final part being incorporated into the Russian Empire. The Poles would rise in rebellion many times throughout the centuries following, and many of those Poles in parts of these failed rebellions, as well as reprisals by the Russian Empire, would be sent to Siberia. And it's here that they actually met the Japanese, because the Japanese were of course a lot closer to Siberia, and it's here that the start of this friendship may be detected. Several Japanese travelers would end up going through Poland in the 19th century, and some Poles would find themselves going the other way and visiting Japan as well. The Japanese author Nitobe Inazo would even write about Poland that it was a samurai nation in his book about Bushido. In 1904, however, this relationship would go to another level. And this was because of the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Russian Empire and the Japanese would fight one another in the Pacific. Now, as part of this conflict, of course, Poland had been incorporated into, or part of Poland had been incorporated into the Russian Empire. And so the Japanese, largely through their contacts in Siberia, made contact with some of what might be termed as the Polish resistance to help them fight against the Russians. One of these was Józef Piłsudski, who of course is a very famous name because he would later be the first Marshal of Poland and would be remembered as the hero who fought off the Soviets in 1920. Another was Titus Filipowicz, and these two would both travel to Japan in 1904 to have a secret meeting with Japanese officials to understand how they might better help each other in their struggle against the Russians. The Japanese, as part of their side of the deal, provided £20,000 in currency for the Poles to buy weaponry and ammunition with, as well as giving along 3,000 guns to be used straight away. With that money, the Poles were able to buy a further 23,000 guns to be used against the Russians when the time came. In return, the Poles were responsible for bringing intelligence to the Japanese about Russian troop movements in Europe, particularly to do with the Baltic Fleet, which of course was stationed off the Polish coast. And this they did to great effect, allowing the Japanese to be able to judge when the Russian fleet would be coming to the east, what their numbers were, what their practices were, what their strengths and weaknesses were, thus greatly helping Japanese intelligence and giving them a better chance in the fight against the Russians. Now, the Japanese would go on to win that conflict, and they would not forget the help that the Poles had provided. In 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War, Japan would continue to support Poland by sending weaponry. The Japanese were also fighting against the Germans in the First World War, and so they had a common enemy, at least in part. At the end of the First World War, the Japanese also voiced their support for an independent Polish state and aided them in their joining the League of Nations. And it's from this point on that the friendship between the newly independent Polish state and Japan would go to another level in the interbellum years. In this photograph, we can see that the Japanese Prime Minister is meeting with a member of the Polish military as well as with a Japanese admiral. And there was a lot of connection and meeting in terms of the respective militaries of the two countries as they both faced the threat of the Soviet Union in the 1920s and onwards. As part of this, the Japanese Red Cross actually went into Siberia to go in with the mission of aiding Polish children who had been captured by the Soviets and sent to Siberia as punishment. As part of doing this, the Japanese Red Cross were actually able to save around 800 children from Siberia, taking them to Japan and then sending them back to Poland, something which greatly aided in the Polish-Japanese relations and fostering more friendship between the two. Various friendship societies would be founded both in Japan and in Poland as a result of this action. At the same time, we also had members of the Polish and Japanese aristocracy going and visiting the other's countries, as we can see here in this photo with Józef Piłsudski, who is seated on the left, meeting the Japanese prince in 1930. His main aim here was to cement a formal alliance between the two countries so that they could spearhead an attack on the Soviet Union, because Józef Piłsudski definitely knew that the Soviet Union would once again try and invade Poland, even though he defeated them once. Now, he was actually one of several Piłsudski brothers. One of his brothers, Bronisław Piłsudski, would actually be even more involved in Japanese culture. As an anthropologist, he would actually move to Japan and marry an Ainu woman, one of the indigenous peoples of Japan, and his statue can still be found today in Japan because he was such an important figure from Poland that went over to study the Japanese way of life and was also a very large advocate for the relationship between the two countries. Unfortunately for the Piłsudski brothers, the plan to cement a formal alliance between Japan and Poland would fall through, as in 1935, Józef Piłsudski would die. Now, the Japanese actually sent a delegation to his funeral in Kraków and would actually bring soil from the Yasukuni shrine to be buried around him there, which is a unique honor that was bestowed upon him at this time. Now, we also see that the Poles and the Japanese worked together in the field of the military intelligence, particularly bringing Polish code breakers over to Japan to try and break the Soviet codes, which they managed to do in just a week's time. Indeed, Polish code breakers would be incredibly important in the interbellum years, and indeed the years running up to the Second World War, also being incredibly important in smuggling out one of the Enigma machines to the United Kingdom, where others could work on cracking the Enigma code, indeed in Bletchley Park, which is a much more well-known story. Some 50 Japanese officers over the interbellum years were rewarded with the Virtuti Militari, which is the highest medal of honor that can be given to soldiers in the Polish armed forces, again showcasing just how close these two countries had become in the meantime. Now, it might be expected that in 1939, with the German invasion and eventual takeover of Poland together with the Soviets, that this relationship would come crashing down. That might indeed be expected, as of course in 1940 there would be the signing of the Tripartite Act, which would bring Nazi Germany, Japan and Fascist Italy all together in an alliance against several other countries. However, the opposite actually seems to have happened, in that when the Germans invaded Poland at the beginning of September of 1939, the Japanese in Civilization 6 language basically denounced Hitler and said, "You weren't meant to invade Poland, and now we definitely aren't going to help you fighting the Soviets." And that is why one of the reasons why the Japanese never got involved with the Soviets is because they were against the invasion of Poland in the first place and publicly protested this at the time. The Japanese would also support the Poles in a more direct way in terms of their intelligence services. Polish intelligence officers and indeed resistance networks were allowed to operate by being based in the embassies of Manchukuo, which was the Chinese protectorate of Japan, thus giving them limited immunity in occupied Europe, where others were unable to function. The Japanese secretly also were able to involve their agents in bringing a large amount of the Polish gold reserve through Vilnius to neutral Sweden so that it would remain out of the hands of the Germans. They also brought a very special Polish flag from occupied Poland through their ambassador to London, where it was passed on to one of the Polish air squadrons that was flying for the RAF, once again showing that the Japanese were willing to cross over the lines of the conflict in order to help the Poles out. Japanese agents and diplomats in occupied Europe were also pivotal in shielding several Jewish Polish children from the occupying German and Soviet forces. This was actually initially done upon their own initiative, in the same tradition that the Japanese Red Cross had gone to Siberia to help Polish children as well. But later on, the Japanese government actually officially sanctioned these actions, still during wartime when they were allied with Nazi Germany, and allowed for these Polish children to be flown out using diplomatic immunity to Japan, from which they would be brought into the service of the Polish ambassador to Japan, I've got to speak Polish properly, Tadeusz Romer, who would then help them get back to the United States, all with Japanese government funding. The relationship, however, would become incredibly strained between Japan and the Polish people and the Polish government in exile within London, particularly in 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the European colonial powers in Asia and of course the United States of America would all enter the war and would be at war with the Japanese within several months. Now, the British would also of course have declared war upon Japan, and so this put a lot of pressure on the Polish government in exile in London to follow suit and declare war on Japan, which they then did. However, what happens next is interesting to say the least. So the Polish government in exile declared war on the state of Japan, but the state of Japan essentially refused to acknowledge the declaration of war and pulled some kind of Uno reverse card and said, no, you, and then didn't go in on it at all and said, we aren't actually at war with Poland. Part of the reasoning behind it was given by Hideki Tojo, who was the Prime Minister of Japan during the war years, who said, we do not accept Poland's challenge. The Poles, fighting for their freedom, only declared war on us under pressure from the United Kingdom, and so actually refused to declare war on Poland, and so it was unreciprocated and unacknowledged by the Japanese. This may actually have been a rather clever move on both parts, and how coordinated this was is hard to tell. By officially declaring war, the Polish government in exile followed suit with the Dutch government in exile, the Belgian government in exile, who would also declare war on Japan and kept the British and the Americans happy. However, because the Japanese refused to acknowledge it, it meant that the tacit understanding, communication and support between the Poles, who remember the deal they were giving the Japanese, was that Polish resistance networks and intelligence networks were sharing all the information they had about Soviet and German intentions, because the Japanese didn't actually trust the Germans all that much, and of course they were very curious to see what the Soviets were up to, while the Japanese were also helping the Poles in numerous ways as well. Now, this would continue until the end of the war, but what's interesting, and the last interesting thing about this relationship between the two, is that formal peace was only actually declared by Poland in 1957, although as far as I'm aware there were no casualties in the war between Poland and Japan, because, well, Poland had already been occupied at this point, and the Polish government in exile certainly didn't go over to Japan to start any trouble there. So I hope you found this video interesting. I came across it and I thought this is one of those stories that needs a History with Hilbert video, just to look at what's actually going on, why Poland and Japan had this interesting relationship in the run-up to the Second World War, during the Second World War itself, and why Japan basically refused to acknowledge the declaration of war by the Poles. There is, of course, another possibility why that declaration of war was not acknowledged, which may be for the diplomatic reason that they were allied to Nazi Germany. They had conquered Poland, and so from the Nazi German perspective, then Poland does not exist as a state anymore. And so if Japan had gone in and reciprocated that declaration of war, they would at the same time be recognizing the entity that had sent it, which was a government in exile because of its ally, and so that might have got them into hot water. But given all the support that they managed to give the Poles in occupied Europe, helping the gold reserve, smuggling Jews out of the country, it seems they weren't too afraid of upsetting the Germans in these matters. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe if you're new. And I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.